Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to what we hope will be another fascinating session. Those sessions this morning were really stimulating. My name's Jock McQueenie. My role in the project, as Liz Ann has said, dates from the very inception of it, I suppose. As Liz Ann said, we met by accident at a forum in Brisbane, discovered that we were on kind of similar wavelengths. The fact that we're Scottish, both, is mere coincidence. The fact that we're both former bus drivers is also mere coincidence. Yes, but from the outset, my role essentially was to look at the strategic and philosophical positions of the various of the MCA in the first instance, in terms of the conversations that Liz Ann and I had been developing, and then to try to align that with partners and the various nuances and constituencies of the arts organisations that we were partnering, or that we hope to partner. And very early in the piece, that the Casula Powerhouse and the Penrith Regional Gallery and Lures Bequest became very clear partners. Since then, we have involved Campbelltown, which is fantastic. Negotiating the arts partnerships was a fascinating process, and we'll be talking about that. And then layering that across the nuances and the different perspectives and the different philosophies and the different constituencies of the various entities was and remains a really fascinating and I think very enriching process of discussion. And then layering those partnerships with the complexities of various corporate partners and the challenging circumstances that they work in was another layer of complexity. And then layering on top of that, conceptualizing and brokering that with the arts community was yet another part of the process. So it's been a long and very interesting and very, I think for everyone involved, both challenging and very enriching process. And it's not over yet. So the purpose of this session, I think, is to speak to some of the key stakeholders in the process and to try to drill down a little bit into the practicalities and how these partnerships actually work. What motivated the partnerships, the partners, what they've learned from it, and with a view perhaps to informing this afternoon's plenary session, to perhaps speculate or envisage the implications of these kinds of partnerships. And to do that, I have with me John Kirkman, who's the CEO of Penrith Performing and Visual Arts, who was the first partner. We have Max Cowan, the marketing director of of the Panthers Entertainment Group. We have Craig Walsh in order of proceedings. Craig Walsh, the artist, who's been working with Panthers and is still working with Panthers. And another Craig Butler, who's the director of city planning for Penrith City. We've asked each of these gentlemen to speak for about 5 minutes about the past, the present, and the future, their motivations, how they got into it, what they got out of it, and where it might go. But to speak to it specifically and without fear or favour from their own perspective and from what it has meant to them. So the logical sequence to that, I think, is in the order that the partners came aboard the project, which will be John Kirkman, Max Cowan, Craig Walsh, and then Craig Butler. So there is a logical flow to the sequence. And so without further ado, I would like to invite John Kirkman up to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jock promises that he'll be really, really strict in the 5 minutes, and I'm really glad about that. Before I go into my anecdotes, and they will be anecdotes, so you can take them with a grain of salt if you like. To start with, just to set some context about me and also about the work that I do, and also to in homage to Michael Kirkman, who just did a fantastic presentation. I used to work in a circus. I used to work in contemporary circus. I used to work in a children's circus, and part of my job was to negotiate with the New South Wales State Government about firing children out of cannons, but never over borders. So I also think that that was perfect training for working as a director of an art museum and also to work in this really extraordinary project. Contemporary circus and community-based circus in Australia has a fantastic tradition, and I have to say my blood boils when I see Cirque du Soleil raking in the billions, because I remember they came to Australia in 1987 to ask us how they should do it. Sadly, they did it really well, and we're still struggling. But anyway, be that as it may. In terms of the C3 West project, Jock came to me, I think it was in 2003, but it was, it's so long ago now, and it's been such an extraordinary journey that it's a bit kind of misty. But I do recall that when Jock came to the Penrith Regional Gallery in the Lewis Bequest, and I was the director there at that time, that for us it was a very interesting time because the building and the program was in a state of rejuvenation and regeneration, and that gallery had been established on the principles of what I would call high modernism, and it was really being refocused into a much stronger sense of access, equity, and cultural democracy. And I have to say that at times that's been a very bruising encounter, but that's another story. So when Jock came to me, I recall this really strongly, is that poor Jock was really at the end of a pretty full-on rant. And I was a bit unhappy when he came, and I was very, very suspicious about what he was proposing. And it goes to a comment that Elaine talked about when she spoke about the project being an outreach program of the MCA. That's a fair enough comment, because there's a great history in Western Sydney of Western Sydney being seen as a satellite, the venue of satellite events. And I was, to be honest, I was fucking tired of being a satellite event for anybody. So poor Jock came and I said, what do they want? You know, are they serious? You know, because I'd also worked in what I would call a sandstone institution, the Australian Museum, and I'm still getting over that. And I'd gone to work in what I would call a brick veneer institution, with a few fibro parts as well. So I was very suspicious about that. Because also there's a great amnesia about Western Sydney, because there's historically extraordinary cultural practice in Western Sydney in terms of non-Indigenous cultural practice that goes right back to, for instance, in Penrith, it was the site of the second performance by theatre in the colony. No one ever knows about that. And also in terms of visual arts, there's a great history that goes back to Roberts, Sidney Long, the Larters, the Lewis. It's an extraordinary history, and that just goes to the 70s. And so I was really a bit bruised, I must say, about how we're perceived. And so when Jock came, he got really full on rant, I have to say, and he was he kind of weathered the storm pretty well. But can I say, in terms of what that issue of what was raised in Artright, and when I did my MA at the College of Fine Arts, I wrote for Artright, so I really respect what Joanna does, Joanna Mendelsohn, and it's a great forum, and I think hats off to that writer, but I wish he'd have rung me in, or he'd rung me in, I would have given him the story. But really, this project has not been about being an MCA outreach project, because none of us would have done it. We would have said, thanks a lot, we're not interested. What underpins this project is there is a wonderful respect that moves across the institutions, that moves across the artists, that moves across the cultural, the cultural partners and the commercial partners. It's a really extraordinary, slow-growing organic process. So it's not Liz Ann's outreach. So solve that one. Okay, and also too, what this project does is it also acknowledges the work of a whole history of cultural practice, because I know in this room there are people who've worked in Western Sydney for many, many years. Catherine Knight, Sally Gray, amazing people who've done extraordinary work. Vandana Ram, who's over here. There's a great continuum of work, and we really wanted this project to really respect that, so that we weren't being seen as the Cambodian soldiers out the front doing this wonderful work for the first time. People have been doing it for years, and well before 1999, I must say. Anyway, so the reason why we wanted to do this project was, in my great sense of suspicion, was I was really interested also to work with the Museum of Contemporary Art and my cultural colleagues in Western Sydney in terms of cultural practice and curatorial practice. So we were really interested to see how projects were curated here, and also to see how the confluence of ideas of how they might move across the region. But fundamentally, I was also really interested in really exploring new paradigms, it's a very pretentious word, but new ways of working with the community, but also to work with the corporate players. And here we come to Panthers. I was really interested to work with Panthers because we'd really kept them at arm's distance because we didn't know very much about them. And one of the great things about this project has been that we actually get to really know intimately what our corporate partners, what these players are actually like. And so the three things that did it for me, that really intrigued me and made me really desperate to work with Panthers, was that in meetings with Max and his colleagues really, really early on, we said, look, we'd love to work with you, but, and they were kind of intrigued. But I must say they were also they were equally suspicious because initially I think they felt that we were just after sponsorship, which we weren't. And so once we said we don't want any money, they kind of, oh, great, okay, let's move on. Okay, but I must say that in talking with them in terms of contemporary practice, I also perceived from them a sense of hurt in that they'd worked with a number of organisations, thank God not mine, and institutions, and again, thank God not mine, where they'd been taken for a ride in a sense, where they'd given money, they'd given support, and there was a kind of sneering acknowledgement, oh, it's Panthers working with contemporary art. Not on their behalf, but on the part of artists and institutions, none of whom we are working with. So we really felt strongly we wanted to actually redress that. And the other is too that we really felt secure in the sense that we could actually really work with them and to really explore what you might perceive as being dangerous ideas. And so I recall at the first meeting with Panthers, it was the time of the first rugby league sex scandal at Coffs Harbour, and with the Bulldogs, not the Panthers, and we said, look, how would you feel if we had an artist who wanted to deal with that? And they thought about it and they said, that sounds really interesting, that sounds really good, we'd go for that. And so we felt really strongly that in fact we could trust them to work with us, and I think hopefully vice versa they felt that they could trust us. And the second time really that I must say I've received a good deal of curatorial lessons out of this project, because I've heard coming from the mouths of people at Panthers, Penrith City Council, much stronger sense of curatorial rigour and framework than we as curators actually brought to the party sometimes. But I must say that for me, the most thrilling moment in the whole project has been to work with Sylvie Blanchet, who I have to say I absolutely adore. But I had a meeting with Max Cowan and Sylvie and the MCA at Panthers after Sylvie and I had spent some time at Panthers playing bingo, watching bingo, talking to people, talking to older people, really examining what the club was like on a Monday night, Tuesday night, in winter, rain, whatever. And where Sylvie sat there and they said to her, well, what do you think of Panthers? And we were so frightened. And she let them have it. She said, this is what I think this club is about. But, and she was very, very direct, as she always is, and also too, in a sense, scathing of elements of our culture, and elements of the way we treat older people, and the way we actually frame culture, and the way we frame leisure. So an extraordinary presentation. I just thought, oh, well, there it goes. She's back to Paris. Project's over. Max Cowan's going to hate my guts. Glenn Matthews is going to dob on me to council. It's done. And I have to say the Panthers guys were astonishing because they sat there and they laughed and they smiled and they said, that's right. That's absolutely right. We agree. We couldn't agree more. And from that discussion, from that presentation where we thought the gig was gone, that in fact it began to grow and grow and grow. And similarly so with other projects, Ash Keating's Activate 2750, which was a pile of rubbish. And to see that extraordinary project, that fantastic negotiation between the artist, the Museum of Contemporary Art, with CETA and my colleagues at Penrith City Council, who worked in very tight timeframes to deliver really quite extraordinary and I think very dangerous project. So for us it's been a very interesting process of trust, of really rigorous kind of analysis and also a great sense of suspicion. And as to the future, have to say that there are a number of projects which are developing in Penrith, in Goulburn. Notice that Havilar's got a few cards up her sleeve, where I think this project is really interesting in terms of what it might produce. And as we watched the previous presentation, which was really inspirational, I have to say, I kept on thinking, well, you know, we can cut it with those guys. And I think this project can actually do that. So for my 50 cents worth, it's my 5 minutes. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's good to be here, a privilege to be here. My involvement with C3 West out at Panthers actually came a bit later than the initial introduction to C3 West. I remember in 2005 I got a memo that was sent around internally to I think about 4 or 5 of the management team out there that said that we've got this proposition before us and we really don't know what to do with it. And it was about C3 West and it was written by our general manager, and in that memo expressed, I think what John just said, a level of inquisitiveness about, a curiosity about what was on offer here. And it clearly stated in there that it's probably something that we could get involved with, but no one really knew how or why. And, you know, I think I read a statement the other day about ideas, and the statement was, every idea is born drowning. And I think this idea was drowning, but there was someone there who was breathing a little bit of life into it. I went along to this meeting and we talked about it, and we decided, well, we need to get Jock back to talk it through again. And Jock came back and he drew up this Venn diagram and these 3 circles that intersected, and he said, that's where we want to be, right in the middle of that intersection. And I thought, and the 3 circles were, of course, commercial, creative and community. What a great place to be, right in the middle of this intersection, and it actually suits our business. So we started talking more seriously, and we got to the point where, yeah, we wanted to engage, we wanted to speak with some artists to work out the sorts of problems and opportunities that faced our business, to have a look at it in a creative way. We recognised that our industry was in a position where we have to change. We had to change, we still have to change. Our business in particular is right in the midst of that. And we saw that, well, certainly I saw that there was an opportunity here, right in that intersection of those 3 circles, to create the necessary ingredients to help with that change in a positive and constructive way. The projects that we thought would be viable for, you know, to, I guess, test the water with this in this little territory was we were coming up to our 40th anniversary for the football team, and so there was an opportunity there to engage an artist to express that. We had a grant from the Commonwealth Government to help reconstruct the stadium that we play football in, so there's an opportunity there, and that probably would have been a good link with that 40th anniversary event. And we also had this sort of strange idea, knowing that we have to change, we developed this idea about the Club of the Future, which had no real expression and no real definition, but we knew that somewhere in the future was a different version of us. And that was a concept that we thought possibly would be a good, something good for an artist to get their head around and inform us about how to address that. So eventually we got to meet a bundle of artists, and the three that we chose to work with were Regina Walter, who is a local and who presented a fantastic project to us, which unfortunately at this point hasn't gone ahead, but it was to do with the mythology of the panther, the Blue Mountains panther. And recently there's been some additional publicity about that. And the relationship of that with both our brand and with our football team. So it was very interesting and very visual sort of proposition for us. There was Craig Walsh, who presented us three possibilities. And in fact, I actually think they're three parts of the same work. I don't know whether Craig would see it that way, but from my point of view, I see that the transition through Craig's three proposition is one that's really important for us. And that's the one that has found its way into this very building, expressed itself here. And of course with Sylvie Blanchet, who wrote a paper for us, and as John described, it was a very confronting paper, and it was titled Panthers of the Future of Panthers. And in that paper I thought it was very confronting, but it was a very precious paper to me. I kept it to myself for probably, 6 or 8 months and didn't show it to anyone. I was too scared. Eventually I did. Eventually I said to our general manager, a new general manager, I said, look, it's time you had a read of this. It's going to make you either very angry, it's probably going to take you through a range of emotions, and it did. But he looked at me and when he'd read it, and he said, this is the truth. And if any of you get the opportunity to read it, I think it would be a worthwhile read, because not only does it tell you about how someone from outside our own society looks at this very Australian, this uniquely Australian, in fact, uniquely New South Wales industry, and sees the value in it, but sees exactly the same dangers in that industry as everyone else in our society sees. And they're dangers that we need to confront. So I recommend you try and get hold of that paper. So the expression, finally, I guess the expression of the thing that we have produced was the Heads Up exhibition, which Craig's going to talk about. And for me, that was the proposition that was, or the problem or opportunity that was put to Craig was, we need to find an expressive way of letting people know the value of this game of rugby league within our community. And some of the images, basically what Craig did was take us out of our normal vision of ourselves and create something that not only we could see as the team that sort of runs Panthers out there, but that the players could also be involved in and see, and that the fans could get involved with and get to understand what the relationships between all of us are. And really that's what we're about. We're about connecting people. And as far as I'm concerned, our involvement with C3 West is finding creative ways to connect with each other in a valuable way, in a way that's constructive and in a way that promotes humanity. The impact on us on me personally, has been quite profound. On our organisation, and someone asked me earlier whether there has been a return on investment, for this sort of activity. And I think that question about, has there been a return on investment is a little bit like the question that was asked earlier, is it art? The fact of the matter is that the return for us is a way forward. It's a future. It's a future that's different to the conditions that we have now. When I was talking about the Club of the Future earlier, paradoxically, I think that the way the Club of the Future has to evolve is by reverting to the past, because the New South Wales club industry, and that's what we're part of, was evolved as a way to connect people to produce common goals. The RSLs got together so that they could protect each other, so that the returned servicemen could protect and look after each other. We're together because we want to protect the game of rugby league and get people involved in athleticism and those sorts of ventures. So we're all about community. We're owned by the community, we operate for the community. A lot of people probably don't believe that and have a cynical view of it. And our brand, and we've done some research recently that suggests that our brand is very much a cringe brand, and I think that's absolutely true. But this project is a way for us to create more value for us, but more importantly, more value for the community within which we reside. So that's the future for us, and I think it's an exciting one, and I'm really honoured to be here. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for having me, and it's great to return to this project actually after 6 or 7 months since it was finished here. I thought I might just outline a bit of the process as an artist, because a lot of the dialogue's been about the process under which C3 West evolves, but what is it like for the artist to get engaged with a project like this? When I was first contacted by the MCA, I had made the assumption also that this was going to be a satellite project for the MCA. We're going to do projects, site-based projects in Western Sydney, in a typical context for an institution in the way that may engage with a public space or a different community. I soon learned this relationship with Commerce and the Penrith Panthers and the partners out there made this a much more interesting project than that, I thought. Whilst it might be perceived that placed limitations on me as an artist, because if I'm to fulfil the criteria that's based on all those individuals that are committed to the project, it actually gave me access to a context in which I wouldn't access any other way. The ability to work with a football club in Western Sydney, to have access to the players, to the fans, to have that support structure, to engage in a conversation or a dialogue about what became art and sport, really. It's much bigger than the issues I'm trying to cover in this project specifically, and all my projects with Panthers is about perceptions. And as Zan mentioned earlier about this idea of how art is perceived and how this institution is perceived, it's also about how football's perceived and rugby league's perceived in Western Sydney. So this became the really interesting context, I think, for producing a work, because it really did have a relationship between the MCA, Western Sydney, rugby league, and what I learnt very quickly from my spending time at the club and spending time at the games is the relationships between these entities is what's really fascinating. And there was one point where I boldly stated that I'd like to do a video project just of a camera set up underneath the table of conversations that went on between all these entities, because it was fascinating. But to get to the point of a proposal, so it was what was very nice about this project. It was the ability that I was actually engaged in the whole process of the development, because I was on board very early. There was a lot of conversation about how it should evolve, how artists are commissioned, how artists should engage, what sort of time periods should we work, and I think that was I felt very involved with the whole process leading up to the point of commission. What happened was that I ended up presenting 3 concepts to Max, and Max presented it to the board out there. And I really focused on the idea of individuals. I found that my experience at the club and the experience of how that game is perceived is very much about a collective entity. It's about the team, it's about the fans, it's about the community. And quite often the way that is presented and perceived is this sort of generic, almost cartoon-like presence, especially with the players, because the sort of media that we see the players in, the marketing surrounding them presents them as these sort of Trojan warriors, that you maybe lose the sense of individuality about the fan and also about the player. So I was really interested in that, in essence, but also how you could extract from that event, which is a very dynamic presence, the game itself, extract from that so you could actually perceive it in a very different way. You could perceive the individuals involved with this in a very different way. So the Heads Up project involved a process, really. It started out as a process. So we engaged a professional photographer to come on board, Josh Raymond, and we set up a booth which we could document the players and the fans directly after the game. I was very interested in seeing the response after this extreme emotive event which had taken place, and the commitment that's made by everyone to that event, how that would reproduce as a documentation, as an image. I thought the still image was going to be far more powerful than the moving image. I thought that's a way of extracting and seeing these people in a very different way to the way we would normally perceive them. And the ability for an audience to actually spend time with them and actually understand that these are individuals who have, the same cravings, goals, passions as anyone else. It's just in a different context. So we set up, as it happened, we documented 6 games. And so we had a booth. So for the fans, as they were leaving the ground, we could invite them, and we had information panels about the project, and they were invited to come in and be documented and take photographs of those individuals. We also had a booth on a separate occasion, had the booth in next to where the players' change room was, so we could pull the players into that booth and photograph them straight after the game as soon as possible. Obviously we couldn't do it straight away, but as it happened, I think there was 5 out of the 6 games were lost during this period. So, that's why I explained it as a process, because that's, I think I was always hoping and expecting or hoping something to come out of the project which I would never have actually conceptually defined prior to the process. And the fact that they lost, and then the way they presented themselves, everyone from the fans to the players, the way they presented themselves with this sense of pride is where the title really came from, heads up, as a concept about how you present yourself to others and hide your emotions. So heads up as a concept, I think, is very important, is an important part of our general culture. But also, I think, in this case, it's a dialogue between photography and the situation and the event that's taken place, because we do present ourselves in certain ways for photography. So these things became really, these are sort of things that emerged out of the process, really, and the fact that they had lost these games. So all the portraits are from losing games. They're taken after losing games. There's 17 portraits, which is the number of a team, the team and the reserves. And it's a ratio of 9 to 7, I think, or 9 to 8, to the fans. So what I'm doing is I'm, positioning the fan as playing as an important role in the understanding of that culture and that community as the players. And in fact, what I learnt was the fans are the people who really have that sort of longevity and association to place. The players are sort of bought to be there and to play that role, and they move on quite often now. So that sense of community that used to exist in rugby league, where the player would be, grow up in that area, play for that team, and probably live out their days, has gone. The actual mechanics of football has changed as a professional sport, but what stays and remains are the people who support it. So all 3 of my proposals are about that. They're about the individuals who are associated and are affected by this activity, this event, which is rugby league. And in the future, we're hoping to do projects which are more about archival, and we're currently working through archives at the Panthers, which, in a way sort of fulfills criteria for the Panthers, because the archives at the moment are in cartons and boxes and sitting in whatever room they can find free, and they haven't been archived. So there's a history there that hasn't been archived. So as an artist, that becomes a really interesting way of taking over curatorial. Before it's deemed curatorial by a curator, an artist can get in there and see, well, what do I think is important out of this documentation? So that's really exciting for me. And that will sort of evolve into sort of object-based installations with light. All the proposals are deemed to occupy different types of spaces. I mean, I think this project ending up at the MCA is really, in my mind, it sort of includes every aspect of how this project is defined. The fact that the MCA is involved, rugby league, the Panthers, and the way of presenting these works within, the power that exists in this institution allows for that vision to change, that perception of these people, the game, and everything to do with it change. So, that was a really exciting, evolution of the project, and I think it evolved that way was basically because we had so much time. The gestation for this project was probably 2.5 years, and that gave me a lot of time to think about how I could engage or affect this concept. in a sort of, in a powerful way, and also utilise the situation that I've ended up in and the ability the MCA's involved, the Panthers, and how you cross that over. So it's really, looking at a site-based project and all the elements that influence that site. And I think the Heads Up project is really effective in doing that. I think the scale, it was really interesting to sort of take on the individual at scale and incredible detail. There was a real emphasis to try and get the maximum detail to a point where it's almost surreal of these individuals. So there is this inhabitation and this gaze. It's associated with a soundtrack. We did a 4-point soundtrack of the whole game. We positioned people around the edge of the game and recorded that. And then we played that from behind the walls. So you had this soundtrack, this immersive sort of soundtrack, which affected the gallery, but also made reference that this reality did exist outside the gallery space. So it made that reference that we are extracting from a situation or an event and positioning it in the gallery, and that's why we can, perceive it differently. So I think there were a lot of things. I mean, it was very interesting to see the players respond to this, because we had to leave some players out, of course, which that whole team ethos sort of became disrupted. But also some of the fans who turned up to the opening as well, and you saw some of the photos of the young children and so on who could see, and they were presented beside their fans, beside their heroes, really, and that idea of presenting them at the same scale, occupying the same space, giving them the same presence as their heroes, is a really interesting process. Now, I don't know, it's hard to gauge how this has all been perceived and how it's, we're hoping to exhibit this work at Penrith, which I think is really important. I think that dialogue is going to be really important, and I think that's where a sense of ownership will exist with that community about this work. But I think, that's pretty well what I've got to say about it. Okay, thanks.
Good morning. So let me take you on a quick 5-minute journey or ramble, and the journey is going to be a little bit about myself, and perhaps myself as a metaphor for the leadership of businesses and government within Australia, and what that's doing for our places that we're planning and designing. But the journey is also going to be about how we do plan our cities, and it's also going to be about the role of the arts in the planning of those cities. And I feel a little bit humble being here today, because there's no doubt in the world there's significantly more intellect in the room in terms of the role of arts and the arts movement generally. I don't know very much about the arts, but I do know a little bit about planning cities. And what sort of city am I planning? Well, Penrith has a community or a population within its area of around 180,000 people, but its economic catchment is around 500,000 people. And as a regional city, we are always focused on that economic catchment. So around 500,000 people is what our council is planning for. And we're described as a growth area. And what are the attributes of those growth areas? Well, I participate, or our council participates, with a group known as the National Growth Areas Alliance. And represented on that group is Whittlesea in Victoria, Rockingham in Western Australia, Moreton Bay, and around 20 other growth areas around Australia. And why we joined together was that we found when we spoke to one another that we had common issues and common challenges. Typically, if you're in Rockingham, Whittlesea, Penrith or Moreton Bay, you'll find that your community is transportation deprived. The jobs that they rely upon are unsustainable. Those jobs won't be there in the future, and there are entrenched inequities. I don't want to dwell on that for too long though, because we don't take an approach at Penrith nor within those growth areas of dwelling on the negatives, because what we think is too often overlooked is the latent capacity within our communities and within the suburbs. And I talk about productive capacity, the economic capacity, the intellectual capacity, and in the context of today, the cultural capacity within growth areas. And as I said, we've been a growth area for some time now. We got pretty good at planning new release areas. Give us a release area in rural paddocks and we'll design it, and we think we'll do that pretty well. We're also pretty good at designing employment areas, but we dropped the ball in terms of areas within the city of particular or less advantage. And if we looked at social indicators or health indicators, you overlay them across one another, you will know that within these growth areas there are areas of disadvantage. And so we've got a program that we call the Established Areas Strategy, and it's a lot to do with what we're talking about today. It's infatuated and focused with community engagement in those areas of less advantage. And it's now been going a couple of years, and the council is just overwhelmed with the work that it's doing. And just a neat little example, we've abrogated our responsibility in these areas in some respects. Previously, in Kingswood Park, which is one of the areas that we're in, they needed the central facility within the bowels of that suburb was a parkland. In the past, we would have designed the parkland in an office not too far from my office. We would have costed it, we would have gone out and built it. What we did on this occasion, we turned that process completely over to the community. We worked with artists who worked through the school and the students to design that park, and the park was just opened the other day, and it's not like any other park that we've done before. And I have no doubt that it'll be the most successful park that we've ever done. Just a little example. So I've talked about that latent capacity that we want to tap into within these growth areas, and in particular within Penrith. And how would we do that? Well, we won't do it on our own, and that's another reason why Penrith's a regional city, because we've never seen ourselves as just being Penrith. We've seen that we serve a broader region, and we've seen that we're only successful to the extent that we work with others. And I think once again that's why I'm here today, to acknowledge the partnership that we have with the MCA, UWS and others, because they're all contributing to liberating these opportunities within Penrith. I was actually overseas recently in some US cities, and they were just exemplars in terms of what they were doing in confronting sustainability and the issues of climate change. And overwhelmingly my observation was that the most resilient cities, the cities that are best confronting the future, are those where the communities are really networked. And I'm talking about the general community, but I'm also talking about government and the commercial community. Those cities are the most resilient, and that's the approach we need to take. So I've painted this picture about latent capacity, an approach of working with a whole range of partners, selective partners, picking the best partners. But what sort of place will we be designing into the future? In the past, the badging that we've put on Penrith is the surprising city. More recently, we've described ourselves as river valleys and lakes. Probably designed by someone in a branding area or a branding company and the like. But do they really tell the story? Do they really paint a picture? Do they excite you? Do they tell you something different about Penrith? John Kirkman was in a discussion with us yesterday, and he used the word dangerous, and I noticed he dropped it into his address today. What about the dangerous city? What does danger mean? You're at the edge. You're creative. You're taking risks. That's why buffhead boys always bang themselves and hurt themselves. They take risks, but they're out there, they're on the edge. They're competitive. So what about a dangerous city? A city, and if we're not dangerous, if we don't have our identity, if we're not standing in the future, how will Penrith be distinguishable from Blacktown, Liverpool, Parramatta, or any other major city throughout Australia? What will be its point of difference? What will be its competitive advantage into the future? So we're looking at the vision for the future, and I think we can take our leads from the inherent qualities. We don't need to borrow from other examples. We can take our leads from the inherent qualities, the qualities of our people. In the case of Penrith, young, casual, a little bit larrikin, connected, very community, very family oriented. And we can take our leads from the landscape, the escarpment of the Great Dividing Range. I call it the bookend of Sydney, which is the most powerful vista as you come to Penrith and across to Emu Plains. So you've got the bookend of Sydney, you've got agricultural presence, rural lands, a river, and you've got our climate, that fantastic heat. So what about we could take on our own identity, our own form and function, distinguishable. But this will require really bold leadership, and I go back to the point I made earlier, not just leadership by the council, but leadership by Network City, leadership by the government, the community and the business interests. And bold leadership can just take cities down entirely different paths. In the 1980s, Vancouver was pursuing the same path as every other North American city. They were infatuated. They said, we'll have one of those motorways that every other North American city's got. We'll have one of those going right through our city. And I don't know the detail, but I suspect there was a backlash probably from some pretty astute future thinkers within the community who said, no, what if we didn't have a freeway? And the government and the council reflected on that, and they overturned a decision to build that motorway. And today Vancouver's consistently voted one of the most livable cities in the world. And the car comes last, and the first is the pedestrian, and then I was interested, they have inline skating and skateboarders, then cyclists, then mass public transportation, then freight. Oh, and if we remember, or at the end, the individual vehicle. So bold decisions can really position cities to be resilient and position them differently into the future. But once again, what will be the vision for Penrith or other cities? And how do we explore that and then define it? Well, at Penrith, we start from an advanced point. I could tell you statistics about the health status of our communities. I could tell you about demographic trends. I could tell you about our economic output. You could find it yourself all on our website. I could talk to you about the jobs imbalance that we've got, and I could talk to you about the infrastructure needs. In other words, we've studied the city to death. But all of those studies have been, or a large amount of those studies have been numerical or statistical. And they draw from either the past or they draw from today. To some extent, they extrapolate out into the future. But even then, do they give us the right messages? Are we really observing the nature of our place and the nature of our communities and their resilience into the future? We aren't, because even when we do talk, we filter what we see, what we understand of the place. We frame things all the time. We carry around prejudices. And so sometimes it's particularly helpful to get others from outside of the city to come in and critique it, to observe. And here I talk about the work of Sylvie and Francois, to hear from more liberal style thinkers, to hear of your faults and in particular to hear of your opportunities, those latent opportunities. And to hear as others, such as Lisanne McGregor, have said that I think we can do something special in this place. And that's where C3 West comes in. I think the 3 projects that have been conducted have been a tremendous value for all of the reasons I've roamed across in a bit of a ramble above. Ash Keating's work in particular was confronting. It caused people to twitch. Amazingly, they were disturbed by this insignificant volume of waste deposited right on John's doorstep outside the Penrith Performing and Visual Arts Facility, the only building in the world that has Joan Sutherland's name on it. Truckloads of waste. Why were they confronted by that? Go to Eastern Creek landfill and see how much we deposit each day. But they were engaged and they were discussing. They were also questioning, is that art? What is it? What is it? What's this? They were debating. So it was confronting. Craig's work he's spoken of, and I won't go back over that. The Camperman Urbane work was particularly powerful. I talked earlier about our geography, the bookends of Sydney, a broad floodplain. One thing you do in Western Sydney is you work with big pallets. We have a site known as the Riverlink site. Council owns half of it. Panthers, well, probably a third, but anyway. It's about 100 hectares. So we're planning for 100 hectares of new mixed-use development, working very closely with the partnership of Panthers and ING. But what will it be? What will it be? Will it be just another Gold Coast? Will it be a Docklands? Will it be Penrith? Or will it just be something else? Where will it take its leads from? How will it be distinguishable? By way of example, if I could just dwell on that for a moment, we're getting right down to the pointy end of making a plan. A lot of my job's the boring stuff of making land use plans, but we've been working on a land use plan. And I talked about me being a metaphor for the leadership. The concepts that are coming forward are in some respects innovative, but in other respects they're obsessed with the financial bottom line. By way of example, the Panthers and ING partnership would tell us that we must have a brand outlet there because that will underpin the viability. Keep this to yourself, it's not very public. But I just go, brand outlet. Brand outlet, it just doesn't do it for me. And why? And I wonder, brand outlet, What if we had something different? What if instead we had a fine-grained series of workshops, laneways and showrooms, almost like you might see in the bowels of Munich, the Bauhaus precincts and the like, with artisans, workers, tradespeople, apprentices, making and displaying their goods. A grunge and some retail character. I tend to think that would be more enduring than a brand outlet. And why do boards and why do governments make decisions like brand outlets, or why are they obsessed with the financial bottom line? Well, I suspect, using me as a metaphor, because they came through an era where they learned by rote. They didn't come around the side of issues. They didn't explore differently. They didn't listen to other viewpoints. I was taught it was this way, and so it was this way. I'm fortunate I have 4 children who now come around the side of issues. And I'm fortunate that occasionally, very occasionally, I speak to John, and less occasionally I speak to Francois and Sylvie. And they come around the side of issues and they paint a different picture. And that's why I think there's a role for the arts in the planning of the cities. I'll move just one more minute. So, where have I gotten to? I think I was interested in Lizanne's point earlier about the role of institutional art and the role of museums. And I truly believe that, led by the work that Sylvie and Francois have done, that we can see the city as a place for art. And how powerful will it be, and how enduring and how resilient will cities be if we embody arts and the creative arts in the physical layout and in the functioning of the city? How powerful will it be if we have a connected city, not just of 180,000 people, but 500,000 people that are liberated and channeling their energies towards innovation and the future of that place? One last example, I sometimes think my job's pretty broad, but I really want to acknowledge the partnership of Panthers and how far they've come. Glenn Matthews is a legend. As a CEO, he deals with getting Frank Pritchard back on the field each Friday or Saturday night, keeping Michael Jennings, dealing with glassings, poker machine taxes, liquor licensing and the like. Tremendously broad job description. The other day, out of his lips, when talking about the work that Sylvie and Francois are doing, he said, yeah, perhaps they could play a role as creative director for our Riverlink precinct. So how successful have we been? And I challenge you to go to any of your other CEOs of licensed clubs and ask them when they last used the term creative director for any of their businesses. How successful has C3 West been when that came out of his lips? So, as I said, I've just been on a tour of some US cities. San Francisco particularly impressed me. It's a city on the edge. It's on the edge. It's mad. It's crazy. You go one street too far, you feel like you're in danger. But you go there because you love it. You walk down to Haight Street, it's got a grunge. It's just fantastic. It's socially, economically on the edge, but it's bloody creative. It's really creative. It's a dangerous city. And I think if we embody the arts in the planning of cities, I think we have resilient and dangerous cities, and that's what I like. Thank you.
Thank you all. There is a bit of time for questions and discussion, so please fire away for any of us. Up the back. Yeah.
I'm interested in the relationship between Melbourne and Sydney in terms of to me it seems like Melbourne has always been involved in its sport, and having spent time in Sydney and so on, you kind of, in the cultural sphere, you don't come in contact with sport in the same way. I was just going to ask the people on the panel whether they feel that's got something to do with the politics of the game, or is it something that's actually inherent to Sydney versus Melbourne? Maybe I should just say that I think baseball's where America's coming from, and football's where it's going, or where it went with George Bush, and was kind of the whole sort of process of politicisation of football as a war.
Well, as a soccer tragic, I should probably pass it on.
It's an interesting subject for the Panthers, I would have
Maybe
thought.
to Max or someone.
I'm a tennis
Or
player,
John.
so I'll pass it on.
I don't know, so I'll pass it on.
I'm from Queensland, so I can't comment.
I won't take on the Sydney versus Melbourne debate, but even a theme running through my address, and I take my leads from many, but I take my leads from Tim Flannery, The Future Eaters also. It's a really powerful book where he talks about how Australia, indeed communities, are really shaped by their environment as much as they shape their environments. And to that end, I just love and that was the point I was making about we can take our leads from our people, but also from our environment. I love it when you come to Sydney on these days and you go to Melbourne and it's black and grey, and that's fine. And Sydney, the girls start to frock up and the guys get their tyres off, and you go to Queensland and it's even more casual. So it's to some extent, my perception is it's about the environment, but patently it's much more than that.
Is there anyone else? Craig?
I think not so much the politics of sport, but I think what was really interesting about this project was, the fact that the project ended up back in a major institution, is that I ended up finding a whole lot of people involved with the art world who wanted to talk to me about football. There was almost an open license. We can now talk about it. It's okay to be interested in sport, because someone who's been interested in, obviously as an artist practitioner, but also a strong interest in sport. I've always understood there has been this clash. And I think in a way it's competitive, and I think we've had mention of that today, and that it's maybe competing for similar audiences. But, I think this project in a way, heads up, it has opened the floodgates to a degree in the way that we may think about sport in a different way and actually build some sort of relationship, because I don't think there was one there at all. I think they were very separate entities, and I don't think it was deemed safe to talk about it or to communicate about it or to act as though you're interested in it within the art world.
Yep.
Can I just...
Yeah, go on.
I'm not a sporting academic, but and as I said, I'm a tennis person. But my observation is that in response to what your question is about Melbourne and Sydney, I think very much that in terms of Sydney and Melbourne, that I think there's a whole element of class, particularly in terms of Sydney with class, in terms of rugby league, rugby union. And I must say that when Sylvie would talk about rugby, it would skir on our ears, because we would all go, rugby league, not rugby union, rugby league. So I think there's an element of that too. And I have to say, I hadn't been to a rugby league game since I was 15, but I found myself on my feet with Sylvie screaming. Screaming when Penrith Panthers scored a try. They lost, but they still scored. So it is about class. I think it's about education, and I think it also goes to what Craig talks about in terms of the elements. So that Sydney is much more beach focused. It's about the beauty of the environment, the climate, whereas Melbourne is dark and grey and fabulous, but it's a much more winter city. But I'm a very shallow rugby league analyst, I have to say.
This over here.
Again, my questions to anyone or every member of the panel. I found all of the presentations incredibly kind of like inspirational and all very positive. And indeed, my question is, are they over positive? Is there, if heads up is the kind of, heads up was the theme of all of the presentation, have there been any tails down aspects to the project? Have there been any negativities at the city council level? Have there been problems that have been not overcome? As an artist, have you had negative reactions? Has there been any negative media coverage from the point of view of the rugby club? Is there a downside? Surely there must be. Are there some negativities that we might also learn from?
All of those things. So there's been negative publicity. I know that when Francois and Sylvie were in Penrith last year, there was a kind of Daily Telegraph inspired campaign. What were these French artists doing in Australia, doing in Sydney? It was a really pedestrian kind of run-of-the-mill stuff. But there was that. And also too, there have been accusations of, well, where's the work? Where's the built work? Where's the work? Which was, placing it in terms of public art, and it was not public art. So some people have been suspicious of the process. I think also too that there's also been some people who have said, and they've said to the artists, that, it'll never happen. Western Sydney's far too conventional for that to happen. So it hasn't been all positive. It's been very difficult sometimes, and it's been very slow, and it's been very frustrating sometimes. So it's not all beer and Skittles. Yeah.
I don't really see any negatives. I see a lot of barriers and quite a substantial amount of opposition, although it probably isn't conscious opposition. I think for my organisation internally, and I was interested to hear someone quote Sylvie as using infiltration. And I think basically, in fact, I think I wrote to Sylvie at one stage and I said, I feel like a double agent here because I'm acting on the inside of this organisation that doesn't really understand what I'm doing. I mean, our board does, in a lot of ways, don't really have an understanding of what this is all about. And to some extent, I guess one of the barriers is my own incapacity to convince them or to educate or to inspire them in a way that would have encouraged them to actually have been here for the opening of that Heads Up exhibition. Not one of them turned up. So to some extent, there are barriers. Now, I think there's certainly barriers probably for the artists more than ourselves in associating themselves with this cringe brand that we are. And I know that there was a journalist from one of the radio stations who interviewed Sylvie and interviewed me and was very harsh in his judgment on this relationship. I found myself getting a little bit angry at the harshness of this judgment, and but at the same time it was something to learn from. And I think it was basically another one of those mirrors of realism that was being held up towards to me and made me realise, well, we've got to think our way around this. As Craig said, we've got to come from the sides and get around or under or over or through all the barriers that present to us.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more, if there is one. Oh, we've got two. Oh, sorry, she got the mic first.
I just wanted to ask, was there any particular reasoning behind having the Heads Up exhibition at the MCA before it was seen in Penrith?
Yeah, I think that was probably my doing. I certainly encouraged that, and the reason for doing that is because I wanted to take us out of our place. I wanted us to be represented in a place where we would not normally be represented. I wanted our fans to see us and to see themselves represented in this institution where probably they don't even see themselves as having permission to enter. But here they were on the walls. They don't see themselves as having permission to stand next to the players except to get an autograph and to idolise them. But here they were. They were on the walls next to these players. And some of them are icons of our game, like Petro Sivanasiva is just a magnificent specimen of a person. He's a great guy, and he's a legend in our game, really. And for those fans to be on those same walls, as Craig said, with the same dimension, it's just fantastic. And the other reason for it is we wanted other people to see that football and Western Sydney is something to contend with, is something to look towards, not with, the sort of cringe you might look towards, the Panthers organisation or Penrith or whatever. It is a place that is worthy of its own representation. And that was the reason why I was pretty insistent that exhibition gets shown somewhere in the metropolitan area of Sydney.
I think also just conceptually about what the work is and about the idea of elevating or creating the scale and presence for, the individuals who play the game, obviously taking it to the MCA just added another whole layer of presence. So, it made sense, and it's interesting that so many partners in this project sort of clicked into gear, and I think really when the concept was presented, I think already Lizanne was thinking about, that would be a great project for the MCA. So everyone has been involved with how it's developed, but conceptually it's all added to the presence of the work, I think. The other thing I'd like to say is, the access that we had through this project to the players, to the grounds, to understanding the game is really credit to Max. I mean, without the right people in those positions who can make that happen, and it's a commitment, it's a strong commitment, not only just to make it happen, to have access to the players, but to actually convince the board that this is a good thing to do, is essential in these projects' success. So, I think we can talk about the whole rhetoric of C3 West, but it also comes down to committed individuals, and I think that's played a big part in the success of that exhibition.
Can I just say too, in terms of that, of the exhibition coming here, there are four Western Sydney-based project partners: the University, Casula, Campbelltown, and Penrith. And we were really happy for it to come here because we were also, not sure about the University, but I know my colleagues Lisa Havilah and Congoriatis when he was at Casula, we were very interested in the whole concept of not being seen as the Western Front, but in fact we were seeing you as the Eastern Front. Seriously.
I think that's a very good note on which to wind it up, and somehow I've got to try. But I guess we've overrun by just a little while, but in relation to the difficulties and the complexities, and I would call them difficulties and complexities rather than negativities. And when we set out on this long path, we knew it was ambitious, we knew it was complex, we knew that we had to get the trust of a lot of people as we kind of have done, and we knew there would be difficulties and complexities. And I think one of the wonderful things about the process thus far has been the involvement of UWS in tracking the UWS team in tracking and articulating the complexities, because it's been a vitally important part of the theoretical and the not just the theoretical end of it, but the strategic way forward, and that's kind of where we're going next. We hope is to fold back to a new set of relationships and a new set of ways of working, and to take what we have learned from those difficulties and complexities and apply it. And none of it would have happened without these guys, and I'd like to thank the panel and the UWS very, very much, and we'll have some lunch. Thank you.